The morning sun spilled across the rolling hills of rural Georgia, bathing the little town in soft gold. Spring had arrived in full bloom, dogwoods and azaleas bursting with color, filling the air with a fragrance that made every breath feel like renewal. For Diana Whitford, 62 years old, Easter morning wasn't just another holiday. It was tradition, woven into decades of family rhythm, a day of polished silverware, fresh lilies on the table, and laughter spilling through the house she had made a home. She stood in her kitchen that morning, humming softly as she pulled trays of biscuits from the oven. The warmth of butter and fresh dough filled the room, blending with the honey glaze already dripping from a baked ham. It was a picture of Southern hospitality, the kind Diana had cultivated her whole life. Every Easter, she told herself the same thing. No matter what had been lost, no matter how many years passed, she would hold this day together for family. Her marriage to Richard Whitford, 65, had lasted 35 years. To outsiders, they seemed the picture of stability. Him a retired banker with a gentleman's smile, her the steady homemaker who kept traditions alive. They had one daughter, Emily, now grown and living across the country in Denver. Emily couldn't come home this year, but she promised to call during brunch. Diana tried not to feel the ache of her absence too much. Still, the house would be full. Their neighbors, church friends, and, of course, Melissa Hargrove, the woman who lived 2 doors down, were invited. Melissa was in her mid-40s, a single mother with a teen son. Diana had always felt a mixture of pity and warmth toward her. She'd loaned her sugar, given her casseroles when she was sick, and even invited her along for gatherings so she wouldn't feel alone. Melissa had become a fixture at their table, someone Diana considered part of her extended family. That morning, though, something about Richard unsettled her. He had shaved twice, lingering at the mirror longer than usual. He had spritzed on the bottle of cologne she'd given him years ago, one that had sat mostly untouched on the dresser. He even changed his tie 3 times before settling on a pale yellow one that matched his pressed shirt. "You look nice," Diana said, trying to keep her voice light as she arranged deviled eggs on a platter. He smiled, smoothing his tie. "Well, it's Easter. Got to look sharp for company?" Company. The word should have felt ordinary, but Diana noticed the glint in his eye, something restless, almost youthful. She pushed the thought away. After 35 years, suspicion felt like an insult to herself, to the life she had built. Yet the pit in her stomach refused to settle. By 11, the front porch was alive with voices, church friends in pastel dresses, neighbors carrying pies, and Melissa stepping onto the porch in a lavender dress that hugged her figure. Diana hugged her warmly, telling her how lovely she looked, even as a small unease stirred in her chest. Inside, the dining table gleamed. The china set her mother had passed down, polished silverware, and a centerpiece of white lilies gave the room a glow. The food spread across the table: honey ham, scalloped potatoes, peas, biscuits, peach cobbler waiting by the sideboard. It was everything an Easter brunch should be, the kind of setting Diana believed reflected not only her home, but her heart. Guests filled the room with chatter about church service, the weather, and spring vacations. Richard played host, carving the ham, pouring glasses of sweet tea. Melissa sat across from him, laughing at something he said, her hand brushing his when he passed her the bread basket. To anyone else, it might have looked harmless, but Diana noticed how his eyes lingered a second too long on Melissa's smile. She sat at the end of the table, hands folded neatly, face calm. She had always believed herself to be a woman of patience, of quiet strength. Still, her instincts whispered. Something was off. Something about the way her husband leaned just a little closer to Melissa than necessary. The way Melissa's laughter carried a note too sweet, too familiar. The clinking of silverware filled the room, but for Diana, a different sound rang in her head. The quiet warning of intuition. For now, she held her peace. It was Easter, after all, and she would not let her doubts sour the day. Yet as she looked down the table, at Richard's smile and Melissa's responding blush, she knew this Easter would not be like the ones before. It was the beginning of something else entirely. The clinking of forks against porcelain filled the dining room as sunlight streamed through lace curtains. Conversation flowed easily among the guests, Updates about church fundraisers, gardens coming alive after winter, and the latest happenings in town. On the surface, it was the picture of warmth. But beneath the hum of chatter, Diana's eyes traced the currents shifting across the table. Richard had taken the seat closest to Melissa, though there had been others available. She noticed how quickly he'd pulled out her chair, his hand resting on the back for a second longer than courtesy required. Melissa, glowing in her lavender dress, leaned in toward him whenever he spoke, her laughter punctuating his words like applause. Diana's cousin Marjorie, seated beside her, whispered, "You've outdone yourself again, Diana. This cobbler looks divine." Diana smiled, murmuring thanks, but her gaze drifted back to the other end of the table. Richard was carving the ham with exaggerated care, Melissa's eyes following his every motion. "You always know how to carve it just right," Melissa said, her voice lilting with admiration. Richard chuckled, puffing his chest slightly. "Years of practice, I suppose." The exchange might have seemed harmless to an outsider, but to Diana, who had spent decades learning the rhythms of her husband's moods and manners, it rang different. Too familiar, too practiced. She sipped her sweet tea, letting the coolness anchor her. The talk around her swirled on. One guest asked about Melissa's son, who was away at a basketball tournament that weekend. Melissa launched into an animated story, her hands fluttering as she spoke. Richard leaned closer, listening intently, nodding at each detail as if it were of great importance. Diana caught the sparkle in his eye, the same sparkle that had once been reserved for her. Long ago, in the early days of their courtship, a pang of memory pierced her chest. She thought of Easter mornings when Richard would sneak up behind her, pressing a kiss against her neck as she stirred the gravy, whispering how lucky he was. Those days felt like sepia photographs now, faded at the edges, but still sharp enough to sting. She forced herself to rejoin the table's conversation, complimenting a neighbor on her dress and asking another about her garden. Yet no matter how she tried, her ears tuned back to Richard and Melissa. At one point, Melissa leaned in to whisper something, her lips brushing near Richard's ear. Diana couldn't hear the words, but she saw the way his mouth twitched into a grin, the way his hand brushed against hers as though by accident. Diana's stomach knotted. She told herself she was imagining it, that suspicion could twist even the most innocent gestures. Yet her instincts, honed over decades, urged otherwise. Midway through the meal, Diana excused herself to the kitchen under the pretense of fetching more tea. She needed air. The moment she stepped into the quiet of the kitchen, the cheerful voices muffled by the walls, she gripped the edge of the counter. Her reflection in the glass cabinet looked back at her, composed but pale. She took slow breaths, smoothing her dress. "A good hostess doesn't falter," she told herself. "A Whitford woman doesn't let cracks show." She carried the pitcher of tea back to the dining room, her steps steady though her heart raced. When she returned, Richard was leaning toward Melissa again, their heads almost touching. The conversation at the table had shifted to Easter traditions. Marjorie shared a memory of egg hunts from their childhood. Laughter bubbled. Richard, however, seemed far more interested in whatever Melissa was saying quietly to him. As Diana refilled glasses, she noticed the silence that fell between them when she drew near. The quick straightening of posture, the sudden distance put between their hands. Her suspicion deepened. Still, she smiled, thanked her guest for their compliments, and sat back down. Hosting was an art she had mastered, smiling while her heart quivered, keeping conversation alive while her own mind raced. For the rest of brunch, the cracks widened in subtle ways. Melissa complimented Richard's tie. "Yellow suits you, makes you look younger." Richard laughed, tugging at it with a boyish grin. Diana's fork hovered above her plate, frozen. Later, as the peach cobbler was passed around, Melissa reached across Richard for the dish. His hand brushed hers, longer than necessary, not quite accidental. They both chuckled softly. No one else seemed to notice. But Diana noticed everything. She sat back, her smile fixed but her eyes sharp, watching as the Easter table that should have been filled with simple joy became a stage for something darker. A quiet storm brewed under her ribs. She would not act rashly, not yet. For now she would observe, as she had always done. But somewhere deep inside, a new thought began to form. If her suspicions were right, This Easter would not end the way Richard or Melissa imagined. Not if Diana had anything to do with it. The meal carried on, the clinking of forks and the hum of voices disguising the tension weaving itself tighter in Diana's chest. She laughed when others laughed, nodded when someone addressed her, but her mind had detached from the room. She felt herself drifting into observation, studying Richard and Melissa as if from a distance. When dessert was nearly finished and coffee was being poured, Diana excused herself once again. "I'll fetch more cream," she said, lifting the small silver pitcher, though it was still half full. She moved into the kitchen, grateful for the chance to breathe away from the table. The kitchen was quiet, bathed in soft light from the window. She placed the pitcher on the counter and steadied herself with a deep breath. The laughter from the dining room felt muffled, almost far away. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of Emily, wishing her daughter were there to distract her from the gnawing unease. Then, faint but distinct, voices filtered from the hallway. Hushed tones, her husband's voice first. "Well, after today, we'll figure it out. She won't suspect a thing." Diana froze, every muscle in her body tightening. She turned slowly, ears straining, heart hammering against her ribs. Melissa's voice followed, soft but tinged with a nervous laugh. "Are you sure?" "She's sharp, Richard. Sometimes I feel like she already knows." Diana's breath caught. The walls of the kitchen seemed to close in around her. She edged toward the door, careful not to make a sound, and through the narrow reflection in the glass cabinet, she caught sight of them. Standing close in the hallway just beyond the kitchen. Richard leaned in, his hand brushing Melissa's arm in a way that was far too intimate to be friendly. He reached up, tucking a strand of her hair behind her ear, his voice dropping to a whisper. Diana couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The gesture spoke volumes. Her fingers tightened around the counter until her knuckles whitened. 35 years of marriage replayed in her mind in rapid flashes. The day she said yes at the altar, the years of raising their daughter, the late nights ironing his shirts, the quiet sacrifices she had made so his career could flourish. Each memory struck like a hammer against the glass of her heart, splintering it further. She wanted to step out, to scream, to demand answers, but something stronger held her back. Dignity, instinct, perhaps even strategy. Richard and Melissa thought they were clever, whispering in corners, stealing glances at the table. Let them think she was blind. Let them underestimate her. A calm, icy clarity settled over her. She would not give them the satisfaction of a messy outburst. If Richard had chosen betrayal, then she would choose patience and truth. She turned back to the counter, filling the small pitcher with cream she didn't need. Her hands steady now. She waited until their whispers faded and they returned to the dining room. Only then did she allow herself a shuddering breath. When she finally followed, the dining room was once again alive with the clink of cups and cheerful chatter. Richard sat back in his chair, smiling. Melissa's cheeks flushed, a little too pink. No one else seemed to notice, but Diana noticed everything. She slid into her chair, her expression serene, and poured cream into her coffee. She lifted her cup with steady hands, sipping slowly as though nothing in her world had shifted. But inside, her resolve hardened. She thought of Emily again, of what she would say if her daughter were here. Emily had her father's stubborn streak but her mother's sharp eyes. Diana imagined her daughter would tell her, "Don't let them make you small, Mama. Don't let them take your dignity." And she wouldn't. As the conversation turned to Easter plans and spring gardens, Diana sat quietly, her mind already moving ahead. She remembered the stack of folded linens in the sideboard, where she had tucked away envelopes earlier in the week. Old habits of organizing and saving had left her with a collection of things that might prove useful. She remembered Richard's phone left carelessly on the counter 2 nights ago, the messages she had glimpsed before he snatched it away. Now the puzzle pieces clicked together, forming a picture she could no longer deny. She set her cup down, her face calm. She would not ruin this brunch in haste. Easter was a day of renewal, and she would make it one of truth. But when the moment came, she would reveal everything, not with screams or accusations, but with the kind of quiet precision that would leave no room for doubt. The storm was gathering, and Diana, for the first time in years, felt a strange strength that comes not from anger, but from certainty. She knew, and soon everyone else would too. Diana had always believed that when betrayal came, it arrived like a storm, sudden, loud, tearing through everything in its path. But sitting at that Easter table, surrounded by pastel napkins and delicate china, she discovered it could also arrive like a whisper. Quiet, subtle, almost polite. The rest of the brunch passed in a blur of polite chatter. To the others, it looked like a simple holiday gathering. But inside Diana, a sharp stillness had taken root. She had heard enough in the kitchen, seen enough in the hallway, to strip away every lingering doubt. The truth was plain. Richard was involved with Melissa. Yet instead of breaking her, the knowledge steadied her. She felt her breath slow, her pulse find a rhythm. She understood, with a clarity that surprised even her, that this day would not end in silence. But neither would it end in chaos. Not on their terms. If Richard and Melissa thought she would collapse, weeping or raging, they didn't know her at all. She had spent decades cultivating composure. She had survived lean years when Richard's work consumed him, nights alone when he traveled for business, the loneliness of raising their daughter when he was absent. She had learned the art of appearing unshaken, even when her world trembled. Now that art would serve her. As the guests moved from the table to the sitting room for coffee and dessert, Diana excused herself once again. This time she went to the sideboard in the dining room, where she kept linens and small keepsakes. Hidden in the drawer were the folded sheets of paper she had slipped there days ago, almost on instinct. She had seen the text messages late one night when Richard's phone buzzed on the counter. Melissa's name had appeared, her words intimate enough to make Diana's stomach churn. Richard had whisked the phone away when he saw her glance, his explanation rushed and flimsy. Diana hadn't confronted him then. Instead, she quietly printed the messages from their shared laptop. Richard never realizing his account was synced. At the time, she hadn't known what to do with him. Confronting him in private felt too small, too easy for him to twist. Now with Melissa sitting bold as brass in her lavender dress at Diana's Easter table, the answer was clear. The evidence would speak for itself. She slid the papers beneath a linen napkin and returned to the sitting room. Guests sipped coffee, nibbled on cobbler, and chatted about spring trips. Richard sat comfortably in his armchair. Melissa perched near him, their knees almost touching. The sight would have pierced her hours ago. Now it only steeled her further. As she moved through the room, pouring refills and smiling graciously, Diana's mind began to weave her plan. She would frame it as a moment of gratitude, a tradition of Easter reflection. She would invite each guest to share what they were thankful for, a light-hearted exercise. Then, when it was her turn, she would share the truth. Not as a scorned wife, but as a woman choosing dignity over deceit. The idea settled into her bones, solid and unshakable. She could already see it, the hush falling over the room, the looks on their faces when she laid down the words Richard had thought would stay hidden. She could see the unraveling of Melissa's composure, the way Richard's confidence would collapse. She did not relish the thought of humiliation. Diana was not vindictive by nature, but betrayal demanded light, and if Richard had chosen to dishonor her in the shadows, then she would answer with truth in the open. For the remainder of the afternoon, she carried on as though nothing stirred beneath the surface. She laughed softly at a neighbor's joke, complimented Marjorie's floral scarf, even helped Melissa clear a few plates. Every gesture was deliberate, every smile carefully placed. If Melissa sensed that Diana knew, she gave no sign. Richard, for his part, looked relaxed, utterly convinced he had maintained control of his little secret. But Diana's silence was not ignorance. It was preparation. When the guests eventually returned to the dining table for one final toast before departing, Diana felt the air shift. This was her moment. She adjusted the napkin on her lap, her fingers brushing against the folded papers hidden beneath. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained serene. Easter, she thought, was a day of truth, a day of renewal. And this year, renewal would mean setting fire to the lies she had been handed. She lifted her glass of sweet tea, her voice calm, steady, even warm. "Before we finish," she said, "I thought it might be nice if we each shared what we're grateful for this Easter." Around the table, smiles bloomed. Heads nodded. The game seemed harmless, even charming. But Diana knew better. This was not a game. This was the beginning of her reckoning. The dining room was awash with afternoon light, golden rays catching the rims of crystal glasses and glinting against the polished silverware. Plates of half-eaten cobbler rested before the guests, their laughter softened by the heavy fullness of a meal shared. Diana stood at the head of the table, her glass of sweet tea raised. Her face, serene and composed, carried no trace of the storm she held within. "I think it's only right," she said, her voice calm, lilting with warmth, "that we pause before parting to share what we're grateful for this Easter." Smiles rippled around the table. A few guests nodded enthusiastically. Gratitude was, after all, a wholesome tradition. One by one, they went around the table. Marjorie, her cousin, gave thanks for good health. A neighbor expressed gratitude for the beauty of springtime blossoms. Another friend mentioned family, clasping her husband's hand. The tone was light, sweet, expectant. When the turn came to Richard, he leaned back in his chair, smugly relaxed. "I'm grateful," he said, eyes twinkling, as though delivering a toast at a banquet, "for good friends and neighbors who make life richer." Melissa flushed a delicate pink, her smile widening as if the words were hers alone. Diana noticed the way Melissa's gaze lingered, the subtle tilt of her head. To anyone else, it might have looked like simple neighborly appreciation, but Diana saw it for what it was, a lover's acknowledgement, silent in charge. The circle moved on. A few more guests spoke, voices cheerful, glasses clinking softly. Finally, all eyes turned to Diana. She lowered her glass slightly, fingers steady on the stem. "I too am grateful," she said, her tone smooth but carrying a weight that drew the room into stillness. "But this year, I find myself most grateful for something I didn't expect." Curiosity flickered in the guests' expressions. Richard's smile faltered slightly, though he masked it with another sip of tea. Melissa shifted in her chair. "I'm grateful for clarity," Diana continued, "for the kind of truth that shows itself when you least expect it, even on Easter Sunday." A hush settled over the table, the kind of hush that comes when people sense a boundary shifting, a moment turning sharp. "I heard something today," she said, her gaze sweeping the table but landing firmly on Richard. Words spoken in hushed voices when they thought no one else could hear. "After today, we'll figure it out. She won't suspect a thing." "That was you, wasn't it, Richard?" Gasps scattered around the table like dropped silverware. Heads turned sharply toward Richard, then Melissa, whose blush had drained into pale shock. Richard's fork clattered against his plate. "Diana, what on earth are you—" But she was ready. She reached beneath her napkin and pulled out the folded papers she had tucked there earlier. With deliberate grace, she spread them across the table. Lines of text printed in black and white. Messages between Richard and Melissa. Words no husband should ever send to another woman, certainly not a neighbor invited into their home. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence of the room amplified every word. "I didn't want to believe it," she said softly, her eyes locked on Richard's. "But when you start sneaking around with a neighbor, when you start whispering in hallways at my Easter table, you don't leave me much choice. Everyone here deserves to know the truth." Melissa reached for the papers, her hands trembling. It's not what it looks like." But no one believed her. Not with the words sprawled out in plain ink. Not with the guilty tremor in her voice. Richard tried again, his voice sharp, defensive. "You shouldn't— This is private, Diana. This isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," Diana interrupted, her tone icy calm. "You chose to bring your betrayal into my home, into my Easter brunch. You sat at this table, smiled at our guests, and thought you could keep me blind. I am not blind." The weight of her words pressed into the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting in their seats. The sanctity of the holiday had cracked wide open, and beneath it lay a raw truth no one could deny. Melissa pushed back her chair suddenly, standing in a rush. "I should go," she stammered, her voice breaking. She grabbed her purse, avoiding every eye in the room as she fled down the hallway. The slam of the front door echoed like a verdict. All eyes turned back to Richard. He sat frozen, his face red, his mouth open but empty of words. For once, the man who always had a quip, always had an explanation, found nothing. Diana remained standing, her glass still in hand. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She only looked at him with a calm steadiness that told everyone present one thing. The betrayal was his, but the dignity was hers. And in that moment, she knew. She had reclaimed the one thing they could never take from her, the truth. The echo of the slammed front door lingered like a crack of thunder after a storm. Melissa's absence left the dining room hollow, as though her lavender perfume still clung to the air in shame. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Forks lay abandoned on plates. Coffee cooled in cups untouched. The guests sat frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Richard's face was a shifting landscape, red from anger, pale from exposure, his lips twitching as he searched for words. His eyes darted around the table, landing on one guest and then another, as though pleading silently for an ally. But the room had already judged. "Diana," he began, his voice uneven, "this isn't how you think." She raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture more powerful than shouting could ever be. "Don't," she said. The single word landed like stone. Marjorie broke the silence first, her voice low. "I can't believe it. Richard?" She shook her head, disbelief etched into her features. A neighbor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Maybe we should give you two some privacy." He half rose from his chair, but Diana's calm voice stopped him. "No," she said firmly, her gaze sweeping the table. "There will be no more whispers behind closed doors. He made this betrayal public by parading it into my home. Let the truth stand in the light." Her poise was steady, unyielding. Even as her heart pounded in her chest, her expression betrayed no tremor. She had made her choice, to meet deception not with tears but with composure. Richard finally found his footing, his voice rising. "You're humiliating me in front of everyone. You've twisted this into some kind of performance." Diana's reply was quiet but sharp as glass. "No, Richard. You humiliated yourself the moment you chose to whisper promises to another woman in our hallway. I am merely refusing to cover it up." The silence that followed was brutal. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one came to his defense. The weight of the printed messages, still lying on the table like evidence in a courtroom, made every denial ring hollow before it was spoken. Suddenly, the phone on the sideboard buzzed. Diana's daughter, Emily, was calling in for the Easter FaceTime she had promised. For a brief second, Diana considered silencing it, shielding her daughter from the spectacle. But something inside her shifted. This wasn't hers to carry in silence anymore. She stood answering the call, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Emily's cheerful voice filled the room. "Happy Easter, Mom." "Hi, Dad." Richard's face twitched. He tried to lean into view, but Diana shifted slightly, positioning herself squarely in front of the camera. Her voice was steady. "Happy Easter, sweetheart. I need you to know something. Your father has been unfaithful with the neighbor. I found out today." The words dropped into the air like stones into still water, sending ripples through the room. Richard lunged forward. "Diana, don't drag Emily into—" But Emily's voice cut in, sharp with shock. "What? With Melissa? You've got to be kidding me." The guests, caught in the awkward crossfire, sat still as witnesses to a scene that had moved beyond brunch and into reckoning. Diana held the phone higher so her daughter could see the room. "I wanted you to hear it directly from me, not in whispers later." Emily's face on the screen hardened. "Mom, I'm so sorry." "Dad, I can't believe you do this." She shook her head, tears brimming. "You always told me family came first." Richard slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. His voice was low, almost pleading now. "Emily, it's not. Things just got complicated." But no one, not even his daughter, was willing to accept his excuses. "I don't want to hear it," Emily snapped, her voice cutting through the stillness. "You've lost my respect, Dad. Completely." The call ended abruptly, leaving the room in weighted silence. Diana placed the phone gently back on the sideboard. She turned, facing the guest once more. "I apologize that you had to witness this, but truth has a way of showing itself when it must. Consider this Easter not just a holiday, but a reminder. Deceit cannot live long in the light. One by one, guests rose quietly, murmuring awkward goodbyes. Their eyes avoided Richard, but each paused to squeeze Diana's hand, their silent solidarity warming her, even through the ache in her chest. By the time the last guest departed, only Richard and Diana remained in the hollow quiet of their once shared home. He slumped forward, his hands covering his face. "You've ruined me," he muttered. Diana stood tall, her voice calm, resolute. "No, Richard, you ruined yourself. All I did was stop protecting your lies." And with that, she collected the plates from the table, her movements deliberate, her back straight. Her life, she realized, would never be the same, but it would be hers again. The house was unnervingly quiet once the guests had gone, the laughter and clinking of glasses replaced by the hollow echo of silence. The dishes still sat on the table, evidence of a holiday brunch that had turned into something else entirely, a reckoning. Richard remained in his chair, slumped forward, his face buried in his hands. He looked smaller than Diana had ever seen him, the confident posture of the banker, the host, the husband. Gone. He was a man stripped bare, exposed before family, friends, and even his daughter. Diana stood at the doorway for a moment, watching him. Once upon a time, she would have rushed to comfort him. She would have placed a hand on his shoulder, whispered reassurances, smoothed over the edges of his mistakes. But those instincts no longer held sway. What comfort could she offer a man who had chosen betrayal over loyalty? Without a word, she gathered the plates. The clatter of china against one another filled the silence as she carried them into the kitchen. Each trip back and forth felt like a ritual cleansing, removing from the table the remnants of both the meal and the illusion of their marriage. At one point, Richard lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. "Diana, please, we can talk about this. It's not what it looks like." She paused, a stack of plates in her hands, and met his gaze. Her voice was steady, almost eerily calm. "It's exactly what it looks like. Don't insult me further by pretending otherwise." His mouth opened as if to argue, but the words died on his tongue. He slumped back again, defeated. For Diana, the decision had already formed. There would be no reconciliation, no pretending they could stitch over a wound so deep. 35 years of marriage had not earned him immunity from consequence. If anything, it made his betrayal sharper. That evening, after the last dish was washed and the house restored to order, Diana sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. She wrote a list, as she always did when life became too heavy. Call Emily, contact an attorney, sort financial accounts, change locks if necessary. The practicalities steadied her, anchoring her against the tide of emotion. She had cried enough in silence over the years for smaller things. She would not shed tears for a man who had thrown away her trust. When she called Emily later that night, her daughter's voice was fierce with anger. "Mom, you don't have to stay. Don't you dare let him talk you into forgiving this." "I won't," Diana promised, her voice soft but certain. "I've made up my mind. I'll be filing for separation." On the other end of the line, Emily exhaled, relief mixing with sorrow. "Good. You deserve so much better, and you won't go through this alone. I'll come down next month. We'll meet with a lawyer together." That promise, simple and firm, brought a warmth to Diana's chest that Richard's presence never could again. In the weeks that followed, the town began to buzz. News of the Easter brunch had spread. Small communities like theirs always had ears. Melissa became the subject of whispers in the grocery store, sideways glances at church. Richard, once respected as a pillar of stability, now found doors closing quietly in his face. Invitations that once came freely stopped arriving. Even at the country club, men who had once played golf with him kept their distance. Diana did not need revenge. Life was handing it to her in steady doses. But she also didn't gloat. She carried herself with grace, showing up at church, volunteering as always, hosting her book club with the same warmth she had always offered. Only now, people looked at her differently, not as the woman who had been betrayed, but as the woman who had stood tall and refused to cower. One Sunday after service, Marjorie took her hand. "You showed remarkable strength, Diana. Not everyone could have handled it like you did." Diana smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for strength. I did it for truth. Sometimes that's all you have left. At home, Richard had grown bitter, sulking in silence, making half-hearted apologies that no longer touched her. When she served him papers weeks later, he looked up in disbelief. After everything, you're really doing this? Yes, Diana replied simply. After everything, I have no choice. And as she signed her name at the bottom of the page, she felt something she hadn't in years: freedom.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.